This is a video taken from a Ukrainian spy drone to the north of Avdiivka. It shows an American Bradley fighting one of Russia's best tanks, the T-90M Breakthrough. The Bradley manages to blind the T-90, causing it to lose control and crash. But this is not what should have happened. Let's go back. The T-90M is designed to destroy other tanks. It should be more than capable of taking out a Bradley. The Bradley is a battlefield taxi, designed to take troops into and out of the fight. So, how did it win? We're going to analyze this footage, delve into the archives, and speak to an expert to find out. This is a Bradley IFV, or Infantry Fighting Vehicle. America gave Ukraine 190 of these mean machines, which Kiev used to equip the 47th Mechanized Brigade. It was designed during the Cold War and first entered service in 1981, though these ones probably date back to the 1990s. And this is the T-90M Breakthrough, the most modern tank in use by the Russian army, and supposedly its best. From the waist down, there isn't much new here. It's basically the same as the old T-72 tanks that Russia's been using since the Cold War. But up top, the tank is brand new and packed full of state-of-the-art kit, starting with its 125mm main cannon, which has been upgraded to fire more destructive shells. Compare that to the Brad's main weapon, which is a 25mm Bushmaster chain gun. The tank cannon is designed to punch through armor, reinforce concrete, and basically blow to bits anything that it might encounter on the battlefield. Whereas the Brad's gun is only really capable of taking out things like infantry and light vehicles, trucks and troop transports. Both the tank and the Bradley have light machine guns for close quarters fighting, which can be controlled from inside, so the crew doesn't have to get out and risk getting shot. And both are covered in explosive reactive armor, or ERA. These are blocks of explosives that are designed to go off when they're hit by enemy shells to deflect them away from the tank. Up here, the Bradley has two anti-tank rockets, so it can take down enemy armor if it has to, while the T-90 turret is covered in all sorts of sensors and cameras. The largest is the commander's main sight, which is known as the Falcon's Eye. It provides a wide view of the battlefield, gives him day and night thermal vision, a laser rangefinder to identify and lock onto targets, as well as a range of other sensors for the onboard targeting computer or fire control system, which is called Kalina. On the other side of the turret is the gunner's sight, the PNMT, which gives a separate day and night thermal view. Just behind that, a wind speed indicator feeds data from the mast to the fire control system, and cameras attached to the mast and the sides of the tank give the three-man crew a 360-degree view of the world outside. So let's see what happens when these two vehicles take each other on in combat. This is the town of Stepove, or what little is left of it, just to the north of Avdiivka. This video was taken in early January, when Ukraine's 47th Brigade were defending it against Russians who were trying to take the city. Here, a Bradley has found itself facing off with a Russian T-90M at very close range. The T-90 opens fire, but misses, before the Bradley drives up close and begins hitting it with rounds from its chain gun. You can see a few tracer rounds flying past the tank, as well as sparks when the turret and the hull are hit. The Bradley drives behind cover, just in time, as the tank fires a second shot, which seems to hit a nearby building. The Bradley keeps up the chain gun fire on the move, made easier by sensors which keep its gun locked on target. You can see a couple more tracer rounds, and the tank getting hit again here. It returns fire, but misses once again. The drone then pulls back to show us a wider view of the battlefield. Over here, a second Bradley vehicle is hiding, and it's going to take over fighting the tank in just a second. The first Brad is almost done, but manages to get off a few more shots before it goes. Suddenly, there's what seems to be a large explosion from the tank, with flaming debris going everywhere. But this probably isn't an explosion. The tank has likely fired its smoke canisters, which are designed to blind the Bradleys and stop their guns from locking on. As the first Bradley drives off, the second one takes up the attack. We know quite a lot about what happened next, because Commander Serhiy and his driver Alexander spoke to Ukrainian TV about it. Serhiy said they initially hit the tank with their armor-piercing rounds, but there was a problem, likely an ammo jam, and so they had to swap to the high-explosive rounds, which you can actually see happen on the video. At first, the gunfire from the second Brad looks exactly the same as the first. The odd tracer round and a flash anytime one of the rounds hits the tank. But then it changes, and there's a bigger flash anytime a bullet strikes anything. Buildings, the ground, or the tank. This is the high explosive ammo, and this should really be where the fight ends for the Bradley. High explosive rounds are designed to take out infantry. They have next to no chance of penetrating the T-90's armour. But Serhiy has a trick up his sleeve. Instead of targeting the tank's hull, he goes for the delicate sights and sensors on top to blind the crew. Where did he learn this clever trick? He tells us himself.
Колись грав в комп'ютерні ігри, я вспомнив все, коротше, і як бити ті танки, і куди бити, бо я мав його зупинити любою ціною. Із-за того, що в мене були проблеми з бронебійними, я просто почав його робити сліпим, щоб він звідти не...
Zoomed in footage shows this strategy in action. Despite having a physical line of sight to the Bradley, the tank never fires back, suggesting his strategy was a success. A fire then starts close to the tank's main gun, and there is another explosion that looks similar to the smoke launchers. But this one comes from the wrong part of the turret and is probably one of the explosive armor plates cooking off, which means the heat of the fire has caused it to detonate. The tank is now in real trouble, and it can only try and hide behind cover as the Bradley keeps up the chain gun fire. When the drone pilot zooms in, we can see the turret has completely failed. It's spinning in circles while still on fire. Unable to navigate properly, the tank narrowly misses a telegraph pole before slamming into a tree. The crew escape from their disabled tank unhurt before the Ukrainians use a drone to finish the vehicle off. This may come as a surprise, but Ukraine is actually not the first time that Bradleys have faced off against Soviet tanks. The first was all the way back in 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, the American-led liberation of Kuwait from Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army. Though Russia wasn't involved in the fighting directly, Moscow was the Iraqis' main arms dealer, and so Saddam's troops were using Soviet tanks. Attacking them was a coalition led by the US, which had a huge amount of armor, including 1,700 Bradleys, which were taking part in their first combat deployment. The operation called for a huge armored charge from Saudi Arabia into Iraq and then across into Kuwait to drive the Iraqis out. Perhaps the most important battle took place at 73 Easting, which has been dubbed the last great tank battle of the 20th century. There, hundreds of Bradleys and around 1,000 American Abrams tanks of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment faced off against Saddam's elite National Guard units in their Soviet T-72s. In one of the opening salvos of the battle, 2 Bradleys managed to take out 5 T-72 tanks using their TOW anti-tank launchers in the space of just a few minutes. Over the course of the next 90 minutes, with the Bradleys fighting alongside the Abrams, the 2nd Cavalry destroyed more than 170 Iraqi tanks and dozens of armored vehicles. In return, they suffered a loss of just 1 Bradley, with 1 man killed and 12 injured. Desert Storm resulted in a swift and crushing Allied victory. Over the course of the operation, just 20 Bradleys were lost, only 3 of which were down to enemy fire. The other 17 were friendly fire. 12 more were damaged, 9 of them due to the enemy, and despite the Bradleys' role as scouts, they actually took out more Iraqi tanks than the Abrams. Overall, the Iraqi army lost 3,000 tanks, 2,000 armored vehicles, and tens of thousands of men in just 100 hours. The Allies suffered only 147 casualties and a few dozen tanks destroyed. Bradley crews gave glowing reports of their vehicles once the fighting was done, praising them as both fast and lethal. Based on those reports, the US military went about improving the Brads, making them easier to spot so they didn't get shot so much by their own side, as well as making them easier to fix. These new versions, dubbed ODS-SA, which stands for Operation Desert Storm Situational Awareness, are the versions that Ukraine is thought to have been given. 3 decades ago, on the battlefields of Iraq, the Bradleys proved themselves superior to Soviet tanks. Putin now likes to brag that Russia's T-90M is the best tank in the world, but seeing one of them get beaten by 2 battlefield taxis that are 3 decades old makes you wonder whether that's really true. Here's what an expert thinks.
What we're seeing here is actually something we call disco turret head in the tank world, where the tank has been so badly bashed up, the crew probably seriously injured inside, have completely lost complete sort of spatial awareness, not knowing where they are. and the tank virtually out of control. It might be driving itself, but one of the vulnerabilities of the Russian tanks we've seen, particularly in the Ukraine, that relatively small amount of hits they get, and then they pretty much go crazy. And as we're seeing there, that tank, that is the last action it'll see. What we're seeing here is a T-90 Russian tank, the most advanced one they have, being absolutely hammered by some Bradley infantry fighting vehicles with a 25mm Bushmaster cannon, which is a pretty small weapon to be shooting at a big vehicle like that. The T-90 is a very basic tank compared to a Challenger 2 or a Leopard 2 or an Abrams. It's got a good 125mm gun, but its protection is very lacking. Its explosive reactive armor, which it appears to have, doesn't seem to work, and it's very susceptible to these $500 drones. So likewise, Putin has also said that the experimental T-14 Armati tank, which is due to replace the T-90, is the best tank on the planet. But again, what we've seen of it, it's been incredibly vulnerable to virtually attack from everything. And I think, the Russians were synonymous with great tanks. In fact, probably the greatest tank in history, the T-34, which the Russians designed and developed in the Second World War, was what every other tank has built on. But it would seem that the T-34 was the height of Russian tank design and capability, because everything they've produced since then has been pretty poor and very vulnerable to even the lightest attack. It's reassuring for the Ukrainians with their Bradleys and their other kit that they know if they can get in range of Russian tanks, they can take them out. The other key element is actually the way that the Russians use tanks. They've lost so much crew that the crews who are now in the T-90s and the T-80s that the Russians have left have virtually no training and can virtually do little more than drive in a straight line, and if they're lucky, actually fire the main armament. It takes a long time to become an effective tank commander. It took me 2 years to really master how to fight a Challenger 1 and then Challenger 2, and I've got thousands of hours on Challenger 1 and Challenger 2. And it's one thing just being able to fight the tank. The key thing is to be able to fight tanks together, what we call combined arms maneuver warfare. Now, that takes a heck of a long time. When I was preparing the 1st Royal Tank Regiment to do this, we had to do 2 years of training before we were deemed fit enough to go on the battlefield. Now, when we look at the Russians, most of their tank action is one tank at a time, as we've seen in this video here. What you need is at least 2 tanks working together to provide what we call mutual support. So as one tank moves, the other puts down fire so that the Bradleys can't actually hit it. But there is no sign at all that the Russians are doing it. Their skills are shocking as well. I'm yet to see a Russian tank with any camouflage on it, which seems extraordinary to me. And I think the fact that the crews are so inexperienced, when you see tank troops of 3 tanks or 4 moving around the battlefield, they almost seem to be tethered, one following the other, mainly because I expect it's only the officer who has a map in his tank. But it makes them really easy targets, very predictable, and they're always very close together, so they can be taken out very easily. So I think it's surprising to me. I thought the Russians would be far better, but they've got worse because they're having to replace their so-called experienced tank crews with new tank crews, and you just can't learn how to do this stuff in a couple of days. It takes weeks, months, if not years. Conversely, when we look at the Ukrainians, at the very start, they, would appear they were naive, but actually they weren't. They were just not trained. They weren't experienced. But over 2 years, they are gaining that experience. And the action we saw with those Bradleys, a number of Bradleys working together, synchronized, really shows that they're getting to grips with this armoured warfare. I've seen Bradleys for many years, First Gulf War, Second Gulf War, and also in Afghanistan. These are really capable fighting vehicles, very well protected in armament terms, but also really pack a punch. They're 25mm Bushmaster cannon, although it's small in tank gun terms. It has a very, very high rate of fire. It has an armoured piercing shell, and as we've seen, fairly easily defeating a T-90 tank. We've seen a lot of them on the battlefield in Ukraine, and although they're 30 years old, they are still really one of the best infantry fighting vehicles around, and have been improved all the time to have an anti-drone capability as well. So I think that is one of the key vehicles that they want to be in, want to fight in, and it's proving really effective. When it comes to tank warfare, actually nothing's changed. If we look at the first great tank battle in 1917 at Cambrai, when my regiment was formed, you basically had a steel vehicle with a big gun moving forward, and it had firepower, it had protection and mobility. But in those days, I as a tank officer would be out of the front of my tank with an ash plant checking that the ground was viable for the tank. Today in Ukraine, they have a drone doing that. Back in 1917, there would be a person in an air balloon looking for targets. Today in Ukraine, there is a drone. But though what we learnt at Cambrai back in 1917 is exactly still what we learn in Ukraine. It's about working together. It's about tanks and infantry and artillery working together. It's about combined arms maneuver warfare. And so although we're over 100 years later, the tank really hasn't fundamentally changed. Things like drones are having a huge impact, and $500 drones are dropping $50 hand grenades through hatches of Russian tanks and blowing them up. We're very quickly learning how to counter that. But the basic premise of a steel vehicle moving rapidly over difficult terrain with firepower is exactly the same as it was 100 plus years ago. Now, I was in the army, for 35 years or so, and every year as a tank commander, I was told that the end of the tank, a bit like the end of the horse on the battlefield. But there is no signs from what we're seeing in Ukraine that the value of a tank used correctly in a combined arms environment is any less than it was at Cambrai in 1917. We in the British, we had Challenger tanks and Warrior armoured fighting vehicles. The Warrior is very similar to the Bradley, actually has a slightly bigger gun, more effective. And certainly the Warriors were very effective against the T-72s, T-55s that the Iraqis had. And I understand the Bradleys were as well. And it really shows the difference between Russian armoured vehicles and Western armoured vehicles. When we look at Western kit against Russian kit, we know the Russians have loads of it. And there is a quality and quantity. Mass is important. But when it comes to technology and the state of the kit, that is also really important. The Russians have lost, it depends what figures you go by. But if the British MOD are saying plus of 4,000, then that can't be far wrong. Now, the Ukrainians have lost a great deal less than that. Of course, you can replace tanks, but actually you can't replace the crews. The crews are the sort of crocodile nearest the canoe. They take time. But not only with tanks that we've seen it, but a whole host of other equipment, fighter jets, attack helicopters, and also anti-tank weapons. So I think the thing that is important here is if we can get enough Western kit to the Ukrainians in time, then they should prevail. Because, as far if we look at it in a numbers game, a Challenger 2 tank is probably worth 10 Russian tanks. And if you use that metric, then Ukrainians could gain that mass that is required for an effective combined arms maneuver. For combined arms warfare to be effective, you need tanks, you need infantry armoured fighting vehicles, you need artillery, you need attack helicopters, and you need air power fighter jets all working together to be able to achieve an advantage. Now, I'm getting more confident that this is possibly likely to happen. Conversely, the Russians, although they have made a bit of ground recently, it's been at the cost of, over 1,000 dead a day around Avdiivka. And we know also they're using crude chemical weapons in the form of CS gas, which is illegal under the Geneva Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention. That's the only way they can move forward. So as the Russians are getting worse, the Ukrainians are getting better. And that gives us some hope for the future that actually Ukraine can start pushing these Russian invaders back.
This is one of 31 Abrams M1A1 tanks given to the Ukrainians by the US and used to equip the 47th Brigade. The M1A1 entered service in 1986. It weighs around 60 tons, is powered by a gas turbine engine that'll run on pretty much any kind of fuel, and is armed with a 120mm main cannon. It is coated in Chobham composite armour, which provides some of the best protection in the world to the crew of 4 who sit inside the turret. At the back of the turret is an armoured compartment where the ammunition is stored, which is separated from the turret by blast doors. That means even if the ammo explodes during battle, the crew will be protected. And on top of the compartment are blowout panels, deliberately weak sections which pop off and vent the blast away from the crew. The Russians claim this tank was spotted by soldiers of the 15th Motor Rifle Brigade who used a Piranha FPV, or first-person view drone, to disable it. There are 2 kinds of Piranha drone, the Piranha 7, which is smaller, and the Piranha 10, which is larger. Both are made up of a quadcopter drone with a top speed of 140 km per hour. The Piranha 7 can carry a load of up to 2.5 kilos and has a limited range because it only contains a small battery. The Piranha 10 can carry a load of up to 4.5 kilos and has an extended range because of its larger battery and more powerful propellers. Both are controlled using multiple radio frequencies, which the pilot can change in flight, making it very difficult to jam. The drones only cost about $500 each, which makes them ideal for destroying high-value targets like a $4.3 million Abrams tank. The Russians claim this tank was hit by one Piranha before they started filming, likely targeting the engine or the tracks, which has disabled it. In military speak, this is an M-kill, or a mobility kill. It means the vehicle cannot move, but is probably repairable if it can be rescued. What we're about to watch is the Russians trying to convert that M-kill into a K-kill, or a catastrophic kill, meaning the tank would be out of action for good. How are they going to do it? By flying another drone into it. The Russians have clearly done their homework, because the second drone hits the Abrams on the back of the turret. The blast causes the ammo to start cooking off, which means the heat from the fire is setting off the shells. But the ammo compartment armour keeps the blast confined to the back of the tank. And the blowout panels pop off here and here, venting the explosion upwards. Because of these safety features, all the crew inside the tank made it out alive. And even though the Abrams catches fire, it doesn't explode. The Russian mission to turn the M-kill into a K-kill ends in failure. This took place in late February and was initially dismissed as a one-off, but barely a week later, 2 more Abrams were lost in the exact same place in almost the exact same fashion. For a tank that is supposed to be world-leading, that seems like a problem. To really get a sense of how the Abrams is faring in Ukraine, we need to dive into the archives and compare it to other tanks. Russia has mostly relied on old Soviet T-72s to fight this war, and they've not handled it well. Ukraine claims to have destroyed around 7,000 of them, and when they go, they can really go. In case you were wondering, this is what a K-kill looks like. This is a legacy of the T-72's Soviet past. When these tanks were built during the Cold War, the USSR had an army numbering in the millions. It needed a lot of tanks, so they had to be cheap and easy to make. The T-72 was the result. It weighs around 40 tons, much lighter than Western tanks, and has a crew of just 3, which means it is much smaller as well. The 4th crew member has been replaced by a piece of kit called an autoloader, which automatically reloads the tank's 125mm cannon after each shot. Because of the way the autoloader works, the spare ammunition is stored directly underneath the crew and inside the turret. If a T-72 is hit and the blast sets off the ammo inside the tank, the result is a catastrophic explosion. That results in these huge turret tosses, otherwise known as the jack-in-the-box effect. Russia's newer tanks, like the T-80 and T-90, fare slightly better, but not by much. They generally have better armour than the older T-72s, but are still based on the original Soviet designs, which means the ammo is still stored in and around the crew. Western tanks are by no means indestructible, but they do a much better job of protecting the men inside. America's Abrams, Britain's Challenger, and Germany's Leopards are also products of the Cold War. Their designers knew they could never match the Soviets for numbers, so to stand a chance, their tanks would have to take multiple hits and keep going. And if they were destroyed, it was important that at least the crew survived to fight another day. Compared to Soviet tanks like the T-72, the Abrams and Challenger are bigger and a lot heavier, but that's because they are better protected. Aside from features like blowout panels on the Abrams, both of these tanks use a specialist kind of armour called Chobham armour. This is made of a composite of different materials layered together. Exactly which ones is a closely guarded secret, but it is thought to offer some of the best protection in the world. The Leopards use a different kind of composite, which is not quite as good but still offers high levels of protection. Like the Abrams, the Leopard and Challenger have 4 crew members, including a loader. The ammo is also stored in a blast-proof container at the back of the turret rather than underneath the crew. This is meant to stop the entire tank exploding in the event the ammo compartment is hit. Despite being heavier than Russia's tanks, advanced engines make them faster and therefore harder to hit. High-tech targeting systems mean their main guns can lock onto targets and fire on the move, so they don't have to slow down or stop, which would make them vulnerable. That is good news for Ukraine, because it has saved the lives of many tank crews which Kiev cannot afford to waste, and potentially the tanks themselves, provided they can be towed off the battlefield. For that reason, the Abrams looks like it does indeed have a place on the battlefields of the future. Here's what an expert thinks.
So here we have footage of the drone hitting the back of the Abrams, which is its most vulnerable point, and it's hit it right on top of the ammunition compartment, which sits at the back of the turret in an armoured compartment. And it's got blowout panels on the top, which you can see in effect there, so that if the ammunition is hit and it cooks off and causes that kind of fireball, it's directed upwards away from the crew inside the tank rather than towards them. But this, of course, only works if the armoured compartment is sealed. So if you're caught as you're opening the compartment to load the gun, you might be in trouble, as the explosive force can be directed within the turret. But there it looks like it did its job and saved the crew. The Abrams itself, it is one of the best tanks out there, but I think before you start looking at the Abrams in particular, you've got to set the scene on tank warfare in general. And I think there's not many examples in the last few decades of large-scale conventional conflict where we can really see how the tank fares on the battlefield. And the few examples that we do have show that the tank is by no means invincible, and nor is it designed to be. So if you go back to 1973 with the Yom Kippur War, where the Israelis were fighting the Egyptians and the Syrians, that war lasted about a month, and the Israelis lost 1,000 tanks, and the Egyptians and Syrians lost 2,200 tanks over the course of the month of fighting. And one of the reasons that the Israelis lost so many tanks was the Saga wire-guided anti-tank missile, which a lot of people at the time had similar conversations with drones today. So this was a very small weapon that an infantryman could carry on his back into battle, lie down, and using a little joystick and a wire could guide it onto the tank, and it took the Israelis by surprise and resulted in a lot of heavy tank losses. Not many years after, you've got the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, and that conflict has a few similarities to today with sort of very static front lines, trench warfare, and there were thousands of tanks lost on both sides in that conflict as well. So I think in general, we're just not used to seeing this kind of fighting, and that we've been taken a bit by surprise at how many tanks have been destroyed, but there's nothing particularly unusual with that. So I guess that brings us onto the Abrams, which is one of the best tanks out there. But one thing that we should bear in mind is the Ukrainians were given the M1A1 variant, which is the older variant. So the Abrams was first designed and entered service in the 1980s, when drones were not much of a problem, and the Americans were thinking about designing a tank to fight the Soviets on the sort of plains and rolling hills of West Germany. So it's got a lot of armor on the front, where you'd expect the enemy to be coming at you, but on the top it has not got as much armour. I think it's about 25 millimetres on the top of the turret and 38 millimetres on the top of the hull where the driver sits. So these are two quite vulnerable points. So if a weapon strikes you there, you are a bit more vulnerable. It's just that when they were designed, this is not where they were expecting weapons to hit them.
It's not just Abrams tanks that are getting killed in Ukraine. It seems no tank is safe anymore.
Figures aren't easy to get, but from open source information, because the Russians and Ukrainians have very high claims of what they've destroyed of each other's equipment. But taking the Oryx database, which is a team that looks through what you can visually confirm through videos or pictures as being destroyed, we can see that the Ukrainians, over the 2+ years of fighting, have lost around 800 tanks, either destroyed, damaged, or captured, and the Russians have lost around 3,000 tanks. So for the Ukrainians, about 1 tank a day, for the Russians, 3.5 to 4 tanks a day, which I think tells you a lot about the design features of Russian tanks. They're a lot lighter, designed more for mobility and firepower than for protection, which is a sort of inverse philosophy to a lot of Western tanks. So looking at the Western tanks that Ukraine has received so far, they've only received 130 of what you would probably consider modern Western tanks. So those are your Leopard 2s, your Challenger 2s, and your Abrams. They received several hundred sort of upgraded Soviet-era tanks from NATO countries, but these 130 modern Western tanks are the best protected. And so far, they have lost 19 of those destroyed and 22 damaged or abandoned, which I think is actually, considering the scale of the fighting and the intensity and the prolonged nature of the fighting, quite impressive that only that many have been lost, especially if you look back to when Ukraine was conducting its counteroffensive. They were attacking against heavily fortified with mines, tank obstacles, well-prepared artillery fire zones, and they were doing this without air superiority and without artillery superiority. And despite that, for being on the offensive for several months, the fact that only 40 tanks of the Western tanks given to them so far have been taken out of action, and some of those will have been recovered and repaired of the damaged and abandoned tanks, I think that's testament to the protective features of Western tanks in Ukraine.
Which begs the question, why is anyone still using tanks if they keep getting blown up?
The combination of firepower, mobility, and protection that the tank offers simply can't be replaced. No other platform can do the same thing. Till a system comes along that can do that, both sides will be desperately trying to get as many as they can. Because you've seen what the drones and artillery and mines can do to a tank when they hit it. But if you imagine what kind of effect that firepower has on much less heavily armored vehicles, whether it's the American Humvee or the Russian BMP, you're a lot more vulnerable, and it's only the tank that can afford you that unique combination of firepower, mobility, and protection.
If no army is about to give up the tank, then what I wanted to know is whether there's anything tank crews can do to better protect themselves.
The massive benefit of a FPV drone is that if you attach an anti-tank weapon to it, you can literally sort of guide it around to the very specific point of the tank that you most want to hit. And there's not much at the moment that tankers can do about it in Ukraine. For stopping drones, electronic warfare is one option. Whacking some jammers onto the tank is one way of interfering with either the drone's targeting systems, if it's a loitering munition, or the communication between the drone pilot several miles away and the drone itself for an FPV. You can try and jam them, although again, as part of the measure-countermeasure, the drone pilots themselves can switch frequencies and try and evade the jamming. You could add extra armor to the weak points. This is what the Swedes did with the Leopard 2s that they gave to Ukraine, and only one of those so far has been destroyed, although several have been hit. The problem with adding extra armor to the top of the tanks is that it adds a lot of weight. And in Ukraine, that's not ideal given the sort of muddy pictures we're used to seeing of tanks getting bogged down after it's been raining. These things are already very heavy, sort of 40, 50, 60 tons. So adding armor is not the route you would want to go. But beyond that, there's also active protection systems, which are a relatively new feature of tanks. Not many have them, but people are very quickly exploring options. And these could include sort of hard kill measures. So you've got a couple of small radars on the top of the tank and a couple of sort of projectile firing systems, which basically fire a shotgun shell equivalent, an incoming threat, and either try and destroy it, disrupt it, or if it's a tandem warhead that's coming in, to try and make it prematurely fire to protect the tank. The problem with an active protection system is they're quite expensive, and it probably adds something like 25 to 50% of the cost of the tank. But if you want to protect it, that's something that I think most people are going to have to do. The issue with the current generation of active protection systems is they're not really designed to deal with drones, but people are already looking into how they can be adapted to face that threat.
And sometimes it isn't about the tank itself, so much as how the tank is being used.
Ideally, your tanks would be used as part of a combined arms effort, working in tandem with other elements of your land forces, but also your air forces as well. The artillery and air power can protect the tank from infantry and drone operators and enable it to work as effectively as possible. And I think one of the reasons why it wasn't supported in the footage we saw is this lack of ammunition. The other problem is the types of vehicles available to support wouldn't be able to do much. They'd be sitting ducks. They've not got the kind of range or protection that the tank does, and they would be very vulnerable to drones. Whereas a lot of Western countries at the moment are now looking into what kind of vehicles can be sent in with tanks and other mechanized formations to protect them from the drone threat. So there's an increased emphasis these days on short-range air defense vehicles, or SHORAD, or very short-range air defense vehicles, which is VSHORAD. And we used to have a lot of these during the Cold War to face off against low-flying attack aircraft or helicopters. And one of these you can see is the German Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, which the Ukrainians do have a few of, and they've been using to good effect against drones. But I think at the moment they're mostly being used to protect critical infrastructure from the Shahed drones. Whereas if they could be on the front line, then they would be able to protect the tanks. And the Americans and others in the West are very aware of this problem and are designing a new generation of SHORAD, mobile SHORAD platforms. The Americans very recently ordered 144 SHORAD variants of the Stryker armored personnel carrier as a stopgap measure while they think about what the best approach moving forward is.
And now for the big question. Does William think tanks have a place on the battlefield of the future?
Yes, they absolutely certainly do. It's just about making sure that they're as good as they can be moving forward.
That's where this tape stops. We'll be back soon to play you through another episode of War on Tape. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you want more videos like this in your feed, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.